The super hit RPG Legend of Spirit is an RPG that tests the bonds between humans and spirits. The protagonist, Luke, an orphan from the countryside, is a whiz with the sword. Not only is he popular with the ladies, he even becomes the hero after gaining favor of the four great spirits. It's one of those upbeat hero sagas which are popular nowadays, and there are no bad endings whatsoever. It's my favorite game. The protagonist tries to utter before his mind blanks out. Ngh. The protagonist sighs confusingly. Luke, are you okay? Says a familiar voice from a familiar lady. Huh, says the protagonist, still confused. The lady then says, Don't give me that. How's your fever? Who is she? Wait, the protagonist says to himself. I feel like I've seen her somewhere before. Again, the protagonist says to himself. Yeah, I think I'm okay now, says the still confused protagonist. Thank goodness that seems to be the case, say the familiar lady. Want something to eat then? The family of the child you saved gave us this as gratitude, the lady asks. I did what? The protagonist says confusingly. Are you half asleep? You saved a child that was drowning in a river just last night. The lady explained. You returned back all drenched and then started getting a fever the next morning, you know, says the lady. That was tough, you know, says the lady. Ah, now I remember, says the protagonist. Since there seemed to be more and more monster sightings around the village last night when I was on my way back from patrol, I saw a child getting dragged by the river, and I jumped in without thinking. The protagonist thinks to himself. The village. What village was I thinking about? The protagonist thinks confusingly. I should have been back in my studio in Tokyo, not in some village, but as the protagonist tries to remember. I remember everything about my daily life in this village, as the protagonist starts to understand. There's something wrong. There's two memories in my head. The protagonist thinks to himself. Good grief. I know it's your habit to jump without thinking when someone's in trouble, but please don't make me worry so much, says the lady worried. That's right, I remember this girl, thinks the protagonist. It's rather rare for you to have a fever like that, says the lady. But not from the village, thinks the protagonist. But, the protagonist says to himself. Aisha, the protagonist yells. Yeah, Aisha says flustered and confused. You're Aisha Ventana, says the protagonist abruptly. Yes, that's my name, Aisha says confused. Wait, don't tell me you forgot the name of your childhood friend, says Aisha worried and confused. She's one of the heroine in the Legend of Spirit. Aisha Ventana, the protagonist thinks to himself. And then, yeah, there's no mistaking it. As the protagonist begins to understand. I'm the protagonist, Luke. The protagonist thinks to himself. The isekai reincarnation. I got reincarnated as the protagonist of my favorite game, Legend of the Spirit, Luke Ventana, says the protagonist shockingly. The Legend of the Spirit is a consciously upbeat story, like ones which are popular now. The protagonist reflects, yeah, I get it though. Some people just don't like those cliché conveniences personality. I'm a sucker for that stuff since I'm your average underachieving guy. The main character who overcomes any difficulties with wits, talents, and strength. I love this kind of happy ending. Yeah, that's right, the protagonist thinks to himself. There's nothing bad about the Legend of Spirit. The protagonist thinks to himself excitedly. All that Luke does miraculously goes well. Now that I got reincarnated into such a hero, my future is basically guaranteed. Hell yeah, says the protagonist ready to start his new adventure.